Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a Game Week 4 preview after a pretty long and uneventful international break. The only news that I would say is quite significant is the Martin Odegaard injury. This obviously impacts owners, but it also has small knock-on impacts on Arsenal's team offense and maybe even Kai Havertz's positioning over the next two matches, I would say. The North London derby is quite significant because we know that Declan Rice is still suspended, and that probably means we could see maybe Kai Havertz dropping back into the midfield. On top of that, I'd like to mention, over the international break, I've recorded a couple pieces of content. We did a What We've Learned team rating series, which is sort of an update on our understanding of team strengths. You can have a look at the video above. On top of that, I also did an episode of FPL Therapy with FPL Raptor, his in-person podcast. Really enjoyed that episode, so do feel free to have a look at that when you have the time. Now, as far as Game Week 4 and the preview, we'll be looking at key topics like what to do with Saka, midfield transfer targets, defender transfer targets, and Game Week 4 captaincy. A lot of these sort of conclusions and the supporting evidence for some of this is provided by Fantasy Football Hub, who we're working in collaboration with. Have a look at their website for some of the great tools which will help increase your rank in FPL. They still have an offer in place, which is 50% off up until the end of this month. So have a look at the link in description below to join and take that offer up. As far as the Game Week 4 preview, we're starting off with what to do with Bukayo Saka. A lot of people have been asking me the simple question of, if you own Saka, if you don't own Salah, do you make that move? Do you maybe even take a hit towards going from Saka to Salah? In my opinion, I still think I would avoid taking the hit from Saka to Salah. The assumption that I have is you have Haaland. So because Haaland is most likely going to be your captaincy anyways, the swing between Saka to Salah isn't enough for me to actually consider taking a hit this week, particularly since you probably won't be captaining Salah. Now, what does change things, of course, is if you do plan to captain Salah, in my opinion, because whenever I try to answer these questions, I try to think about it in terms of almost like a math equation, right? If you're thinking about, let's say, going for Salah a week earlier than maybe you would have planned, maybe you actually plan to go for Salah because he's the best captain in Game Week 5, and that's fine. But if you're doing it on this week and you've already used some free transfers early, you're taking a hit to do so. Ultimately, you'd probably want a big swing in terms of expected points between someone like Saka and Salah. So here, using these sort of Fantasy Football Hub projections, you can have a look at the kind of gulf of the move. On top of that, you're probably downgrading in another position as well, right? A lot of people are doing something like Isak to João Pedro. Now, Isak to João Pedro is actually a curious one because I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a downgrade for Game Week 4, but you can argue that for Game Week 5, it is a bit of downgrade. And also, similarly, both have actually rougher fixtures in Game Week 6, so it's not that comparable. So the question, of course, is whether you do it for this week, for Game Week 4, for a hit. I probably wouldn't do it. But once again, if you have confidence that, let's say, Salah is going to overperform, if you are, let's say, buying into the narrative that Arsenal will struggle, particularly in the midfield, generally speaking, playing away from home in the North London derby, I can understand definitely taking a hit, but I probably wouldn't do it myself. For people who actually have 2 free transfers, for people who have transfers saved up, so 3 right now, which congratulations, that's the first time you've probably ever had 3 transfers in FPL, but I would definitely do that move 100%. Not only is Salah a much better sort of asset to own in Game Weeks 4, it feels better getting him a little bit ahead so that you can get that full swing of the sort of points advantage, right? Because you know that Saka in Game Week 5 is also going to have a pretty tough game week. It's a good week where you can sort of double the advantage of owning Salah over Saka for 2 weeks' time. So I think I would definitely make that move if I had free transfers saved up. And that's pretty much how I would answer that question. A lot of people are also doing something like Isak out or Bruno out. And ultimately, I would say have a look at Brighton assets, right? In the midfield, if you're looking for cheap assets, you've got players like Minte around. If you can actually afford to go for a Liverpool midfielder, consider Sobbo. Harvey Elliott is injured, and Sobbo's minutes must be perfect over the fixture run. I'm sure he can't play every single minute, including Champions League, but of course, his minutes just look absolutely nailed. As far as the forward position, of course, the likes of João Pedro, who we mentioned very often, would be my favorite transfer target. But if you're planning to wildcard very quickly, Welbeck is actually someone I would still probably prefer in the short term over João Pedro, just because I think he would be locked down to play the next 2 game weeks as the 9 for Brighton. That's just my thoughts. But of course, João Pedro is the safer, the better medium long-term pick, just because he is someone who's on penalties. I do think he's got a lot of priority in terms of the minutes going forwards. You can see how important he is when, let's say, Welbeck, even though he's performing well, becomes an early substitute. I think that's more of an age issue, more of a pressing sort of situation issue as well, because of what João Pedro can bring to the table for 90, 95 minutes a game, which Welbeck probably can't in terms of a physicality standpoint. So that's sort of my answer towards whether you should go out of Saka. Now, if you actually have plans to, let's say, move away from Saka, and maybe it's just simply avoiding him for game week 5, if you don't have too many transfers, if you wanted to avoid Salah for whatever reason, I still think the plan of going from Saka to Son in game week 5 is very viable, particularly if you're planning to wildcard. Now, if you're not planning to wildcard, what I will actually say for the people owning Saka right now is you can actually generally consider not selling Saka at all. Because if you've used your free transfers already, you want to start hoarding them up. You might have to take the L versus Salah in the next 2 weeks, but actually it could be very beneficial for you if you're planning to wildcard much later down the line and you're planning to use the wildcard as an insurance to actually maybe keep Saka for game week 6 and 7. Understand that you'll probably lose out a little bit in terms of value in game weeks 4 and 5 in terms of expected points. And then you can actually manage your team really well because you'll probably have more free transfers than the rest of the field who'll be yo-yoing between Saka and Salah and back to Saka on game week 6. And maybe you'll actually come out a little bit ahead if things fall in your way. So that's another consideration as well if you're a little bit more long-term minded. As far as captaincy for this week, I thought it would be useful to jump into it because I've already mentioned how important, I guess, Salah is over the next 2 weeks. For game week 4 specifically, I would have to say I would use Rob T's graphic here. It's still very clear for me that Salah is the second best captaincy pick. I think Haaland is very clearly the best captaincy, but there's some people who are already on Salah only structures. And I think the question those managers would be asking is, do I actually have to take, hits to maybe go for someone like Erling Haaland? I genuinely would not do so. If you already own Salah, you have a Salah only team structure, I'm totally comfortable going for Salah as my captaincy for the next 2 weeks. I feel you're more than covered. And on top of that, if you go for Haaland, and maybe that's for a hit, because usually that's the sort of transfer suggestion that I've seen, ultimately you're going to have to deal with Haaland immediately after this game having an Arsenal fixture, which is just not ideal in my opinion in terms of trying to recoup the value of your hit. So I would try to avoid going for Erling Haaland until probably game week 6, 7, or 8. So those are my thoughts in terms of if you have Salah and if you have Haaland, what to do. If you obviously have 2 of them, which I think a lot of wildcard drafts that I've seen this week have the 2 combined, simply because you can just sort of pre-book that Salah to Saka transfer on game week 6 if you're wildcarding now, and then capitalize on Salah's short-term amazing fixtures, even up until 7 if you want to do so. And so ultimately, there's a lot of value in actually just having both, but I wouldn't stretch my team to do so. I wouldn't take a hit to do so. I would only consider going with Haaland plus Salah on a wildcard, and therefore captaincy for me is pretty clear. The third best captaincy option that I would say is actually going to be Palmer. I think Palmer or Eze are my favorite options outside of these 2, but I think they're very, very far short. Palmer ultimately has an away fixture. Eze is probably the pick that, has everything going for it, right? Talisman, all the set pieces, all the attributes. I guess if you want to say he's in form now. But ultimately speaking, he's got an amazing fixture, Leicester at home, one of the fixtures to target for the season. So he probably is my favorite captaincy shout. But Palmer's right there. He's been training over the international break. He's fully fit, and I think that's a huge plus. As far as the midfield transfer targets, what I would actually say is Minte is probably my favorite transfer target of this week. And that's simply because, we've talked about how João Pedro is such an obvious transfer, particularly for people trying to downgrade within the forward position. Or ultimately, if you own Armstrong, you might have actually decided to make that move already. But in the midfield, I think there's a lot more choice. And some people have still been looking at picks like, let's say, Smith Rowe, Adama. But I do like Minte in the short term. It's really the best way to utilize the short-term transfers. But I have to go back to another pick that I suggested last week, which is Sobo. If you can go for Sobo as one of your transfer targets, I think that unless that's, let's say, blocking you from someone like Salah, if you're tripled up on Liverpool, you obviously can't get there. But if you have, let's say, 2 Liverpool picks that you really like, in my opinion, if you already own Salah plus another defender, you don't necessarily need to look at someone like Jota or Luis Diaz as being absolutely essential. If you are in the sort of price bucket of the 6.5s to 6.7s, you can't, let's say, stretch towards the Luis Diaz's of the world. It's totally fine to actually go for Sobo. I think he's, once again, playing amazing minutes, better minutes than Jota and Diaz, and he's actually got into incredible positions as well. Now, the underlying stats clearly aren't close, but you also have to factor in the minutes. So that's why I think Sobo is actually such a great pick. Even going back to just the most recent game where we had the United game, I mean, he completely wasted a chance. And I know Carragher actually completely slandered him on commentary, rightfully so, I'd say. But that's the kind of quality of positions that you can actually see Sobo's continuously appearing within. And I think that's wonderful. So those are my midfield transfer targets. Rodgers is still a pick that I would like a lot if you're actually looking for a transfer target. And Bowen is another pick I would suggest as well for people looking for a little bit more of a long-term pick, right? With Luis Diaz, with Jota, I would say maybe the minutes could be a little bit dicier, particularly when Champions League is rolling around and you see much more rotation within the team. But with someone like Bowen, I think his minutes are guaranteed. If you're looking a little bit more long-term, West Ham actually generally have a good run of games. The one poor fixture I would say is game week 8 in the distance for West Ham, but ultimately this is the time where I would consider actually going for someone like Jared Bowen right now. De Bruyne is someone who I think we've missed the boat on potentially just because Gundo is there. Foden's back in training. I think his minutes will be reduced going forward, so we're not going to see, unlikely I would say, the 85, 88 minute performances that he's put in so far in the early points of the season. And I have to say, De Bruyne owners have been extremely unlucky. You can also, of course, once again, wait until game week 6 if you've been choosing to do so with someone like Brian Mbeumo, because ultimately he's the best transfer target really in the distance for most of the midfielders. And I think a lot of people and a lot of us managers don't own him right now. So if you want to just pause, roll your transfers, wait until game week 6, that's also an extremely viable strategy. Moving on to the defender transfer targets for game week 4. I feel like we have a lot of choice, and particularly because of the Konsa knock, right? So if you don't have someone like Konsa, or you have Konsa in your team and you're trying to follow the news and trying to react to a potential knock for Konsa, maybe even having to make a defender transfer, the reality is Guardiola is just an amazing pick right now because his minutes seem absolutely nailed. We know that Ake had a really devastating injury within the Netherlands game, so at that sort of price point, Guardiola is always someone that we can definitely look at, and I think his minutes should be good, even though, let's say, Man City have Champions League. But for me, I would still go for Robertson over Guardiola. For me, Robertson is my favorite 6.0 defender in the game right now. Ultimately, when you look at someone like Gabriel, he's a transfer in the distance, but Robertson actually provides you a lot of value now as he's also a very strong open play and set piece attacker. So I actually really like Robertson. I know a lot of people have been trying to stretch towards Trent. And whilst Trent has been incredible on the underlying stats, I just don't think he can actually sustain the gap that he's created between players like Porro and Robertson for now on a sort of per 90 basis. Another point to mention is a lot of people have sort of been using Trent's stats per 90 and showing that he's been an extremely attacking player. Yes, of course, he's been creating the most amount of goal involvements just in an absolute basis, right? Not regarding minutes, not per 90s right now. But once you contextualize that Trent is actually playing around 70, 75 minutes per game, the per 90 stats don't look so good on someone like Trent. If you compare it to someone like Porro, who plays effectively 95 minutes per match, versus someone like Trent, who could be playing 70, 75, then there's a big gulf in terms of how you compare these per 90 stats. So just be careful of what stats you're looking at. And of course, we're only 3 game weeks in with data. We don't need to just be using this season's stats. That's why I still play a lot of reference to both this season's stats, whilst using the entire backdrop of the previous few years of stats for a lot of players. But Robertson, as I said, is my favorite pick because he kind of blends within the two. Liverpool have just looked really good as a defense so far. We talked about how they look like an upgraded defense under Slot with the team rating episode. They have some tougher fixtures later down the line after game week 6, and we'll find out really whether, you know, they stand that sort of test that they've sort of passed with flying colors so far. But yeah, Robertson is definitely my favorite pick. Now, in terms of sort of transfer targets that are much cheaper in the sort of 4.5 range, I would definitely go towards Dunk this week as one of my favorite picks. He just simply has one of the better fixtures here for game week 4. Now, Brighton are a team that unfortunately also have some pretty poor games in the distance. So game week 6, for example, is a pretty tough fixture for Brighton. So you can definitely consider whether you want someone from Aston Villa like Pau Torres instead, particularly with the context of the Konsa knock, right? I don't know if Konsa is ready to play, but I don't think there's really much separating Konsa and Pau. I do think Konsa is a slightly better aerial threat, which is why I have Konsa in my own team. But if you're actually someone who's actually looking to make the transfer, Pau Torres makes a lot of sense for this week as well. And I have to mention that Guehi is also another very interesting 4.5. Ultimately, Dunk has the best fixture, but over the sort of short term, I'd probably go Dunk, Pau, and Guehi in that order, but there's not too much separating all these picks. If you want to go with the pick that doesn't bore you, I guess since everyone owns Dunk, those are your options. A lot of people have been asking about, what about going for the fullbacks? Or maybe going for someone like Van Heck. I think Van Heck makes a lot of sense too, but keep in mind that Dunk has always had a lot of threat from set pieces. He also has taken set pieces in the past. So that's a huge gulf between him and Van Heck. And keep in mind, of course, the fixtures do get slightly worse for Brighton quite quickly. As far as the other 4.5s, though, I think Dean is the one that has been mentioned the most to me. My concern really with Luca Dean is last season, as I said, using that as context, we've seen Moreno rotation a lot. Maatsen is that iteration of rotation. He was signed for a lot of money, and so far Luca Dean has actually played really, really well. He's even gotten some returns so far. What I would mention, though, is with Champions League and sort of considering Luca Dean and his sort of propensity to play himself out of the team at times, I think just there's so much chance for Maatsen to take away the minutes that you want from Luca Dean. Because one thing that I'll give Emery credit for is he's always happy to make an early sub. If we remember last season, Dean, Moreno, Cash, these are all players who were prone to early subs last season before 60 minutes. So whilst it's nice and whilst it's cute to kind of have a player playing like Trent right now, who's starting every game, getting subbed off at 70-75, locking in the clean sheet, maybe even getting the clean sheet whilst his team loses the bonus and the clean sheet, it's very unlikely that I think I can be comfortable enough to say that Dean will hit that threshold always above the 60 minutes. So that's why I still have a lot of concerns with Luca Dean and why I'm sticking to these 3 picks here, which are sort of your boring center back options. Other defensive transfers that I would mention are quite interesting would probably be within the goalkeeping position. I'll also point out that, we were waiting for news on who would be the number 1 for Brighton. Ultimately, we have that confirmation with Verbruggen starting last week, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. So he's definitely a goalkeeper that I would think for the long term is also very, very interesting. Because even though Brighton, yes, they do have some tough fixtures, I do have quite a lot of confidence in them as a defense, and therefore I quite like Verbruggen as a pick. On top of that, you actually have some options in the 4.4 territory. This also applies to the defenders too. So you have players like Muric and you have players like Mikolenko who are 4.4, who ultimately have a pretty good run of games coming up. Muric specifically here starting even with Game Week 4, whereas with Everton, Game Week 4 is the tougher fixture with Aston Villa away, but after that, Mikolenko just generally has a good run of games at 4.4. I think that's actually a really good price point to look at, particularly since we've taken a lot of price falls, and we probably need to be looking at players that are actually very good picks even still at 4.4. So those are my thoughts in terms of the Game Week 4 preview. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care and goodbye. And also, if you're not already doing this, please subscribe.